It was a cold, quiet evening outside the gleaming SpaceX headquarters, the kind of night where the world seemed to hold its breath. A soft glow from the towering building's lights spilled onto the streets, casting long shadows over the nearly empty sidewalk. Employees trickled out of the gates, their conversations buzzing with excitement about the latest rocket launch. In the midst of their hurried steps stood a young girl, barely 12, clutching a tattered cardboard box against her chest. Her oversized coat hung awkwardly on her small frame. "Excuse me, sir, ma'am, would you like to buy some candy?" Her voice was soft, almost drowned out by the hum of passing cars. She moved carefully between the people leaving, her head slightly bowed, her words a mix of hope and hesitation. Most walked past without a glance, their focus on their phones or conversations. A few smiled politely but kept walking. Her grip on the box tightened as the weight of rejection settled on her small shoulders. But then, as she took a step forward, she froze. A man stood at the edge of the sidewalk, engrossed in his phone. He was dressed simply, in jeans and a plain black shirt, but there was something about him, his presence, his aura that was unmistakable. The man was Elon Musk. The girl hesitated, her heart pounding. She had heard about him, seen his face in the news, but meeting him here, so close, felt unreal. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. "Mister," she began, her voice trembling, "would you like to buy some candy? It's $2 each." Elon stopped scrolling, his gaze shifting to the girl. His expression softened as he took in her appearance, the patched coat, the scuffed shoes, the way she clutched the box like it was her lifeline. His security team, standing a few steps behind, exchanged uneasy glances, but Elon held up a hand, signaling them to stay back. "What's your name?" he asked, crouching slightly to meet her eye level. "Layla," she whispered, her grip on the box tightening. "I'm trying to help my mom. She's sick, and we need money for rent." For a moment, Elon didn't respond. He studied her, as if trying to piece together the story behind her words. The employees passing by slowed their steps, their curiosity piqued by the unusual sight of their CEO in such a candid moment. "How many candy bars do you have?" Elon finally asked, his tone calm but with a hint of urgency. 15, Layla replied quickly. "But you don't have to buy them all. Just one would help." Elon reached for his wallet, pulling out a crisp $100 bill. He handed it to her, his expression unreadable. "I'll take them all," he said simply. Layla's hands trembled as she took the money. "But this is too much," she stammered, her voice breaking. "I can't." "Keep the candy too," Elon interrupted, standing up straight. His gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, as if he were about to say something else. But before he could, Layla spoke again, her voice breaking the silence like a crack in glass. "Do you think someone like me could ever work in a place like this?" she asked, her words shaky but filled with hope. Elon paused. The question hung in the air, stark and heavy. For a man known for solving impossible problems, this was a question that seemed to strike deeper than most. His security team exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to expect. The employees who had stopped to watch held their breath, sensing the weight of the moment. Elon finally spoke, his voice steady but thoughtful. "Layla, big ideas often come from the most unexpected places. Don't stop dreaming, and don't sell yourself short. Come back here someday and show me what you can do." Her eyes widened, a small, hopeful smile breaking through her nervous expression. "I will," she said softly, her words carrying more determination than he expected. As Elon walked away toward his car, Layla stood frozen, clutching the money and her candy box tightly. She didn't notice the whispers spreading among the employees who had witnessed the exchange. She didn't see the faint smile that lingered on Elon's face as he glanced back at her from the window of his Tesla. For her, this was just a moment, a spark in the middle of a dark, uncertain night. But for Elon, it was something more. As the car pulled away, his thoughts remained on Layla's question, echoing in his mind like an unresolved equation. "Someone like me," he murmured to himself, a flicker of an idea beginning to take shape. Something told him this wasn't the last time he'd see her. "Tracy," he said, calling his assistant, his voice breaking through the hum of the car's engine. Get me a report on all our community outreach programs. I want to know how we're helping kids like Layla." The car sped off into the night, but the spark she had lit was far from fading. The following morning, Elon arrived at the SpaceX headquarters earlier than usual, his mind still replaying the brief conversation with Layla. He sat in his office, staring out of the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the sprawling launch site. Rockets stood tall in the distance, but his thoughts were far from Mars or engineering plans. The simplicity of Layla's question haunted him, gnawing at a part of his mind he rarely let linger on. "Someone like me," he murmured again, tapping his pen against the desk. Moments later, Tracy walked in, a tablet in hand and a puzzled expression on her face. "I pulled the numbers you asked for," she said, setting the device down in front of him. "We've got a few STEM workshops and occasional partnerships with schools, but it's not much, Elon. Definitely nothing designed for kids like her." Elon's fingers drummed against the table. "That's not good enough," he said sharply, more to himself than to Tracy. He glanced at her. "I want to build something bigger. Something that actually gives these kids a shot: internships, scholarships, mentorships. A real pathway." Tracy raised an eyebrow, already sensing the enormity of the idea forming in his mind. "You're talking about a whole program," she said carefully. "That's going to take time, resources." "Just make it happen," Elon interrupted, his voice firm. "Find the team. Draft the proposal. I want this on my desk in 2 weeks." Tracy nodded, hiding her skepticism as she walked out of the room. She had worked for Elon long enough to know that once his mind latched onto an idea, there was no stopping him. Later that afternoon, Elon wandered into the factory floor, where the hum of machines and the buzz of engineers filled the air. It was his way of clearing his head, immersing himself in the controlled chaos of building the future. But as he walked past the towering equipment and rows of workstations, his eyes caught sight of Sam, the night shift supervisor, adjusting a complicated piece of machinery. "Sam," Elon called out, his voice cutting through the noise. The man turned, startled to see the CEO standing there. "Yes, Mr. Musk?" "How'd you get started here?" Elon asked, his tone casual but his gaze piercing. Sam hesitated, confused by the question. I used to work as a car mechanic. When SpaceX opened applications for general mechanics, I applied on a whim. Didn't think I'd get in, to be honest." "No degree?" Elon pressed. Sam shook his head, now feeling slightly defensive. "No, sir. Just experience. But I worked my way up." A faint smile tugged at Elon's lips. "Exactly." He nodded, his thoughts already spinning. "Thanks, Sam." As Elon walked away, an idea crystallized in his mind. Talent wasn't confined to Ivy League diplomas or polished R-SUMS, it was everywhere, waiting to be discovered. Kids like Layla didn't lack potential, they lacked opportunity. And if SpaceX could find ways to launch rockets, surely it could find ways to launch lives. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elon found himself pacing the length of his office. His mind raced through possibilities, scenarios, and logistics. He thought of Layla, her worn sneakers, her trembling voice, and the quiet determination in her eyes. What would her life look like if no one ever stopped to listen? How many others like her were out there, unnoticed and unheard? The intercom buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. Tracy's voice crackled through. "Elon, there's a girl at the gate asking to see you. Says you bought candy from her last night." Elon froze, the pen in his hand stilling midair. "Layla?" "That's what she said. Security wants to know if they should send her away." Elon didn't hesitate. "No. Let her in. Bring her to my office." Minutes later, Layla stepped into the expansive room, clutching the same battered cardboard box, now nearly empty. Her eyes darted nervously around the high-tech space, taking in the sleek designs and futuristic models scattered throughout. She looked impossibly small against the backdrop of innovation, but there was a quiet strength in the way she held her head high. "I didn't mean to bother you," she began, her voice soft. I wanted to thank you for yesterday." Elon leaned back in his chair, studying her with the same curiosity as before. You didn't need to come all this way just to say thank you, he said. Layla hesitated, her grip tightening on the box. It's not just that, she admitted, her words spilling out in a rush. I don't want to sell candy forever. You said I should come back one day. So I did. For a moment, Elon was silent, her words hanging in the air. The audacity of it struck him, but so did the courage. She had taken his casual remark as a challenge, and now here she was, standing in front of him, asking for a chance. You want to work here? He asked, his tone more curious than skeptical. Layla nodded, her chin lifting slightly. I don't know anything about rockets, she admitted. But I can learn. I work hard. I'll do whatever it takes. Elon leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. The determination in her eyes reminded him of something of himself, years ago, when the odds were stacked against him. All right, he said finally. You start next week. Layla blinked, unsure if she'd heard him correctly. What? Internship, Elon clarified, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. After school. A few hours a week. Let's see what you've got. Tears welled up in Layla's eyes, but she blinked them away quickly, nodding furiously. I won't let you down, Mr. Musk. I promise. As she walked out of his office, clutching her now empty candy box, Elon watched her go, a rare flicker of hope stirring in his chest. Sometimes, he thought, the smallest sparks could ignite the brightest flames, and something told him this was only the beginning. Layla's first day at SpaceX felt like stepping into another world. The sheer scale of everything, the towering rockets, the endless rows of workstations, the hum of machines was overwhelming. She clutched a worn notebook and a pen as Tracy led her through the sprawling complex, her oversized hoodie hanging awkwardly on her small frame. Engineers moved briskly, their eyes glued to screens or blueprints, barely sparing her a glance. The weight of it all pressed down on her, but she kept walking, her steps steady even as her heart raced. This will be your spot, Tracy said, gesturing toward a small desk tucked into the corner of the engineering floor. It was bare except for a computer and a stack of manuals. You'll be shadowing different teams for now, learning the basics, observing how things work. Don't worry about impressing anyone yet. Layla nodded, though her nerves made it hard to speak. Thank you, she managed, her voice quiet but steady. Tracy paused, her sharp gaze softening for a moment. Just remember, everyone here started somewhere. Even Elon didn't know what he was doing at first. The words gave Layla a flicker of courage as she sat down at her desk. She flipped open her notebook, the blank pages staring back at her like a challenge. Around her, conversations buzzed with terms she didn't understand: orbital mechanics, thrust-to-weight ratios, aerodynamics. She didn't know where to start, but she was determined to figure it out. Her first assignment was simple: observe a team working on a prototype for a rocket component and take notes. She wasn't allowed to touch anything yet. But Layla watched intently, scribbling furiously in her notebook, her eyes darting between the engineers and their intricate diagrams. At lunch, she found herself sitting alone in the cafeteria, picking at a sandwich she had brought from home. The other interns, older and more polished, sat in groups, their conversations peppered with technical jargon. Layla kept her head down, feeling out of place for the first time since stepping into the building. Mind if I sit here? A familiar voice broke through her thoughts. She looked up to see Sam, the night shift supervisor, standing with a tray of food and a friendly grin. Layla nodded, relieved to see a familiar face. I heard about you, Sam said as he sat down. You're the kid Elon brought in. Layla's cheeks flushed. I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing, she said softly. Sam chuckled. Around here, it's a big thing. But let me give you some advice. He leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly. This place isn't just about being smart. It's about showing up, working hard, and proving you belong. People will doubt you, that's a given. But don't let that stop you. You've already got Musk's attention, and trust me, that's no small feat. Layla nodded, his words sinking in. Thanks, she said, her voice a little stronger. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Layla shadowed another team, this time working on software for an automated control system. She didn't understand much, but she asked questions whenever she could, jotting down the answers in her notebook. By the time she left the building that evening, her head was spinning with information, her notebook filled with barely legible notes. But despite the exhaustion, she felt a small spark of pride. She had survived her first day. As she walked out into the cool evening air, she noticed Elon standing near the entrance, speaking with a group of engineers. His sharp gaze caught hers for a moment, and he gave her a small nod before turning back to his conversation. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her feel like she belonged. When she got home that night, her mother was waiting for her in their tiny apartment, her face lighting up as Layla walked through the door. "How was it?" her mother asked, her voice filled with a mix of worry and hope. Layla set down her bag and smiled. "It was hard," she admitted, "but it was amazing." Her mother pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. Layla's eyes welled up, but she blinked back the tears. For the first time in a long time, she felt like the future was something she could reach for, something she could build with her own two hands. But as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, a thought crept into her mind. She was here now, but could she really keep up? Could she prove herself in a place filled with some of the brightest minds in the world? She clenched her fists, her resolve hardening. "I'll work harder," she whispered to herself. "I'll show them I can do this." And deep down, she knew that this was only the beginning of a much bigger journey. The following weeks at SpaceX were unlike anything Layla had ever experienced. Each day brought new challenges, and each challenge felt like a mountain she had to climb. The engineers she shadowed worked at a pace that left her breathless, their conversations filled with technical jargon she struggled to keep up with. Her notebook became her lifeline, crammed with notes, sketches, and questions she couldn't yet answer. Some days were harder than others. There were moments when Layla felt invisible, like a shadow flitting between towering giants. The other interns, with their polished R-some-s and confident strides, barely acknowledged her. She overheard whispers, some curious, some dismissive. Is she really here because of Musk? What does she even know about rockets? But she refused to let their words crush her. Every evening, she pored over her notes, searching the internet for answers and tutorials. Her laptop, a borrowed relic her mother had managed to find, often overheated from the sheer number of tabs she kept open. But Layla didn't care. Each late night spent studying was a small victory, a step closer to proving she belonged. It was during one of these long evenings that she decided to take a chance. She stayed late after her shadowing hours, quietly watching as the engineers debated the design of a new component for a rocket's landing system. She didn't understand every detail, but she noticed something, a recurring issue they couldn't seem to resolve. Her hands trembled as she approached the table where they were gathered. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice barely cutting through their heated discussion. The room went silent as the engineers turned to look at her, their expressions a mix of surprise and curiosity. "I was just thinking," Layla began, clutching her notebook tightly. "What if you changed the alignment here?" She pointed to one of the diagrams on the screen. "It might reduce the stress on the joint during the landing." For a moment, no one said anything. Layla felt her cheeks flush, her heart pounding as she braced herself for dismissal. But then one of the senior engineers leaned forward, squinting at the spot she had pointed to. "She might be onto something," he murmured, his tone laced with intrigue. Another engineer nodded slowly, pulling up a simulation to test the adjustment. The room fell into a tense silence as they watched the results. When the simulation finished, the change had reduced the stress significantly. The senior engineer turned to Layla, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "Good catch," he said simply, but the weight of those words hit her like a tidal wave. Layla nodded, her face glowing with pride as she quickly retreated to her desk. She spent the rest of the evening replaying the moment in her mind, the thrill of contributing something meaningful leaving her buzzing with excitement. The next day, as she walked into the engineering floor, something felt different. The usual whispers were still there, but now, some of the glances held curiosity instead of skepticism. A few engineers even nodded at her as she passed by. By the time Elon appeared on the floor later that afternoon, Layla's small success had reached him. He stood in the doorway, watching her as she meticulously reviewed another set of blueprints, her pencil darting across her notebook. "Layla," he called, his voice cutting through the hum of the room. She looked up, startled. "Yes, sir?" "Come with me," he said, turning without waiting for her response. Layla scrambled to grab her notebook and followed him to a small meeting room. Inside, a whiteboard covered in equations and diagrams dominated the space. Elon gestured for her to sit down as he picked up a marker. "I heard about your suggestion last night," he said, his tone even but probing. "Good work. But I want to see how you think." Layla swallowed hard, her palms sweating as she nodded. "What do you want me to do?" Elon sketched a rough diagram on the board, a simplified version of a rocket component. "Tell me what you see. What's wrong with this design?" Layla's heart raced as she studied the diagram. She felt the eyes of the most innovative mind in the world on her, waiting for her answer. She took a deep breath, focusing on the lines and angles. "The weight distribution here," she said hesitantly, pointing to a section of the diagram. "It seems uneven. That could create instability during flight." Elon's lips curled into the faintest smile. "And how would you fix it?" Layla paused, her mind racing through everything she had learned so far. Slowly, she explained her idea, her voice growing steadier with each word. When she finished, Elon capped the marker and leaned back. "Not bad," he said, his tone carrying a note of approval. "You've got a good eye. Keep using it." Layla left the room feeling like she was walking on air. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't just a tag-along or a charity case. She was contributing, learning, and growing. But she also knew that this was just the beginning. The real test was yet to come. A month into her internship, Layla began to feel the weight of the expectations she had placed on herself. Every day at SpaceX felt like a trial, a constant push to prove she belonged among some of the brightest minds in the world. She had made progress, small victories here and there, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she still had so much to learn. Her breakthrough moment came late one evening. Most of the engineering floor had cleared out, leaving only a few scattered teams working on urgent tasks. Layla, as usual, stayed behind, reviewing diagrams and scribbling notes in her now heavily worn notebook. She had just started packing up to leave when she overheard two engineers at a nearby workstation arguing. "We're running out of time," one of them said, frustration lacing his voice. "If we don't figure this out, the entire timeline for the next launch is at risk." The other engineer sighed, rubbing his temples. "The thermal shielding isn't holding up under repeated stress tests. We can't move forward until we fix it." Layla's ears perked up. Thermal shielding. She had just spent the last week shadowing a team that specialized in heat-resistant materials, poring over their data, and asking more questions than they had patience for. The answers she had written down suddenly came flooding back. She hesitated. They hadn't asked for her input, and the last thing she wanted was to overstep. But then she remembered Elon's words, "Don't sell yourself short." Taking a deep breath, she walked over to the workstation. "Sorry to interrupt," she said nervously, clutching her notebook. But, I might have an idea." The two engineers turned to her, surprised to see the young intern standing there. One of them raised an eyebrow. "You might have an idea?" he repeated, skepticism clear in his tone. Layla swallowed her nerves and opened her notebook, flipping to the page where she had jotted down notes about heat-resistant polymers. "The issue might be with the material's composition," she began, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "I read that adding a layer of silica aerogel could improve heat dissipation without increasing weight too much." The engineers exchanged a glance, their skepticism giving way to cautious curiosity. "Silica aerogel?" one of them asked, leaning closer. Layla nodded, pointing to her notes. "It's lightweight and it can handle extreme temperatures. I know it's not part of the original design, but it might be worth testing." The room fell silent as the engineers processed her suggestion. Finally, one of them picked up the phone. "Let's run a simulation," he said, dialing a number. Over the next hour, Layla watched as the engineers tested her idea. The tension in the room was palpable, each passing minute stretching out like an eternity. When the simulation finally ended, the results flashed on the screen. The thermal shielding had held up under stress, exceeding the previous design's performance. Wholly one of the engineers muttered, staring at the screen in disbelief. He turned to Layla, his expression a mix of surprise and respect. "You just saved us a week of work. Maybe more." Layla's cheeks flushed with pride, but she managed a small smile. "I just wanted to help," she said softly. Word of her contribution spread quickly. By the next morning, nearly everyone on the engineering floor had heard about the intern who had stepped in and solved a problem that had stumped seasoned engineers. Some were impressed, while others were skeptical, dismissing it as beginner's luck. But Elon wasn't one to dismiss anything lightly. He called her into his office that afternoon, his gaze sharp but not unkind. "I heard about the thermal shielding," he said, motioning for her to sit. Layla nodded nervously, her notebook clutched tightly in her hands. I thought it might work," she said. Elon studied her for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. "You thought right," he said simply. "But tell me, why did you speak up?" Layla hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Because I realized I didn't come here just to watch. I came here to contribute, and if I don't speak up when I think I can help, then what's the point?" A flicker of a smile crossed Elon's face. "Good answer," he said. "But remember, speaking up comes with responsibility. You've got potential, Layla. Don't waste it." As she left his office, Layla felt a newfound confidence settle over her. For the first time, she didn't just feel like an observer in the world of SpaceX, she felt like a part of it. But she also knew that every step forward brought new challenges. The stakes were only going to get higher, and she had to be ready. Deep down, she welcomed it. After all, she hadn't come this far just to stop now. As the weeks passed, Layla's reputation on the engineering floor began to grow. She was no longer just the quiet intern who clutched her notebook, she was becoming someone people noticed. Engineers started greeting her in the hallways, occasionally stopping by her desk to ask how she was finding the work. Some still regarded her with mild skepticism, but she could feel the shift. Slowly but surely, she was carving out a place for herself. One evening, Elon held an impromptu meeting on the floor, gathering the teams to discuss an urgent issue with the upcoming launch. Layla stood at the back, listening intently as he outlined the problem. A critical part of the landing system was failing under repeated simulations, and they were running out of time to fix it. "This isn't just a delay," Elon said, his voice calm but firm. "If we can't solve this, the entire mission will be jeopardized. I want every possible solution on my desk by tomorrow morning." The room buzzed with energy as the engineers began breaking into smaller groups to brainstorm ideas. Layla stayed back, her mind racing. She didn't have the technical expertise to compete with the senior engineers, but she couldn't ignore the nagging thought that maybe, just maybe, she could offer something valuable. She stayed late that night, poring over the blueprints and data she could access. Her eyes burned from hours of staring at her screen, but she kept going, sketching out ideas and running through calculations in her notebook. She knew her approach was unpolished, even naive, but she refused to let that stop her. By the time she finished, it was well past midnight. She looked down at her notebook, the pages filled with scribbles and diagrams that barely made sense even to her. But she had an idea, a risky, unconventional idea that she couldn't shake. The next morning, as the teams prepared to present their solutions to Elon, Layla stood in the corner, clutching her notebook tightly. She wasn't sure if she had the courage to speak up. After all, what were the chances that her idea would even be considered? But then Elon entered the room, his sharp gaze sweeping across the crowd. He nodded at the engineers closest to him, motioning for them to begin. One by one, they presented their ideas, some complex, others straightforward. Elon listened carefully, occasionally asking questions or pointing out flaws. As the last engineer finished, the room fell silent. Layla felt her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to speak, but the fear of making a fool of herself held her back. And then Elon's voice broke the silence. "Does anyone else have something to add?" The words hung in the air like a challenge. Layla took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she raised her notebook. I have an idea," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. All eyes turned to her, the room suddenly heavier with curiosity. Elon's gaze locked onto hers, his expression unreadable. "Go ahead," he said. Layla stepped forward, her legs shaky but her resolve firm. She opened her notebook to the page she had spent hours working on and began to explain her idea. Her voice wavered at first, but as she went on, it steadied. She outlined her proposed changes to the landing system, pointing out how they could redistribute the stress and increase stability without adding significant weight. When she finished, the room was silent. Layla felt a lump form in her throat as she waited for anyone to respond. One of the senior engineers finally spoke, his tone cautious. "It's unconventional," he said, glancing at Elon. "But it might work." Elon nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on Layla. "Run the simulation," he said simply. The next few minutes felt like hours as the team entered her modifications into the system. Layla stood off to the side, her stomach churning with nerves. She could hear the faint hum of the simulation running, but she couldn't bring herself to look at the screen. And then, suddenly, the room erupted in murmurs. Layla glanced up, her heart leaping as she saw the results. The modifications had worked not perfectly, but well enough to solve the immediate issue and keep the mission on track. Elon stepped forward, his gaze sweeping across the room before landing on Layla. "Not bad," he said, his tone carrying a hint of approval. "Sometimes the best solutions come from the least expected places." Layla felt a wave of relief and pride wash over her, but she knew this wasn't just about her. It was a reminder that even the smallest voices could have an impact if they dared to speak up. As the meeting dispersed, several engineers stopped to congratulate her. Even those who had been skeptical of her before offered nods of respect. Layla's confidence grew, not just in her abilities but in her place at SpaceX. Later that day, Elon called her into his office. "You did good today," he said, leaning back in his chair. "But this is just the start. Don't let one success make you comfortable. Keep pushing." Layla nodded, her determination shining through. "I will," she said. As she left his office, she couldn't help but smile. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't just trying to keep up, she was making her mark. But deep down, she knew that the hardest challenges were still ahead. And she was ready for them. The following weeks brought a whirlwind of activity at SpaceX as the team prepared for the upcoming rocket launch. The stakes were higher than ever, and the tension on the engineering floor was palpable. Layla found herself thrown into the thick of it, no longer just observing but actively contributing. Each day pushed her further out of her comfort zone, testing her resilience and determination. One evening, as the deadline loomed closer, Elon called an emergency meeting. The landing system, which had been patched with Layla's earlier suggestion, was showing signs of instability under more extreme simulations. The room was packed with engineers, each bringing their expertise to the table in a desperate attempt to fix the issue. "We're running out of time," Elon said, his tone sharp. "We either solve this tonight or the mission gets delayed, and that's not an option." Layla sat quietly at the back of the room, her notebook open but untouched. The conversations around her were fast and technical, far beyond her current understanding. For the first time in weeks, doubt began to creep in. Maybe she wasn't ready for this level of pressure. Maybe her earlier success had been a fluke. As the discussions grew more intense, Elon suddenly turned to her. "Layla," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "What do you think?" All eyes turned to her, and for a moment, Layla froze. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tried to form a coherent thought. I'm not sure," she stammered, feeling the weight of the room's expectations pressing down on her. But then she remembered something Sam had told her during one of their late-night talks. It's not about knowing everything. It's about trying something no one else is thinking of. Taking a deep breath, Layla flipped through her notebook, searching for an idea that had been brewing in the back of her mind. It wasn't fully formed, and it wasn't perfect, but it was something. "What if," she began hesitantly, "we use the auxiliary systems to redistribute the load during the landing sequence? It might take some of the stress off the primary system." There was a moment of silence as the room processed her suggestion. Then one of the senior engineers spoke up. "It's risky," he said, frowning. "We've never tested something like that under real conditions." "But it's possible," another engineer countered. "We'd need to reroute some of the controls and adjust the timing, but it could work." Elon's eyes narrowed as he considered the idea. "Run the numbers," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The next few hours were a blur of activity as the team worked to implement and test Layla's suggestion. She stayed close, watching as her idea came to life under the hands of the more experienced engineers. Despite her nerves, she couldn't help but feel a spark of excitement. Finally, the results came in. The simulations showed that the adjustments had significantly improved the system's stability, enough to proceed with the launch. The room erupted in a mix of relief and cautious optimism. Elon turned to Layla, a rare smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Good instincts," he said. "Keep trusting them." As the team dispersed, Layla sat quietly at her desk, her mind still reeling from the intensity of the evening. She knew this was another step forward, but the pressure and responsibility were beginning to weigh heavily on her. Later that night, as she walked out of the building, she found Elon standing by the entrance, staring up at the sky. He didn't turn as she approached, but his voice broke the silence. "You did well today," he said. "Thank you," Layla replied softly, stopping a few feet away. Elon finally turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. "Do you know why I keep pushing you?" Layla shook her head, unsure of what to say. "Because you remind me of what it felt like to have everything to prove," he said. "That drive, that hunger, it's rare. Don't lose it." Layla nodded, his words settling deep in her heart. "I won't," she promised. As she walked away, she couldn't help but glance back at him, standing there under the vast night sky. For all his brilliance and success, there was something profoundly human about him in that moment, a man who, despite everything he had built, still carried the weight of his own expectations. Layla didn't know what the future held, but she was determined to keep moving forward. The journey was far from over, and she was ready for whatever came next. The day of the rocket launch arrived, and the energy at SpaceX was electric. The culmination of months of work had led to this moment, and every team was laser-focused on their respective tasks. Layla stood near the observation area, clutching her notebook as engineers buzzed around her, their voices overlapping in a symphony of urgency and excitement. She had barely slept the night before, her mind running through every adjustment, every test, every decision that had brought them here. From her corner, she could see Elon standing at the center of the control room, his gaze fixed on the live feed streaming from the launch site. He didn't speak much, but his presence commanded the room, his confidence steadying even the most nervous engineers. "Final systems check," a voice crackled over the intercom, and Layla felt her pulse quicken. This was it. The countdown began, and the room fell silent. Layla gripped the edge of her seat, her heart pounding in her chest as the numbers ticked down. 10, 9, 8. She held her breath, her eyes glued to the screen. When the engines roared to life and the rocket began to lift off, the room erupted in cheers. Layla felt a surge of pride, but it was quickly tempered by the knowledge that the most critical part of the mission, the landing, was still ahead. As the rocket ascended into the sky, Elon turned and made his way toward her. She straightened instinctively, her notebook still clutched in her hands. "How do you feel?" he asked, his tone calm but probing. "Nervous," Layla admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Good," Elon said with a faint smile. "It means you care." She nodded, but the weight of the moment pressed heavily on her. She couldn't shake the thought that if something went wrong with the landing system, if her suggestion didn't hold, she would never forgive herself. Hours later, the rocket began its descent. The control room was tense, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. Layla stood at the back, her hands clasped tightly as the live feed showed the rocket aligning for landing. The first few seconds were flawless. The adjustments she'd proposed seemed to be holding, the stress on the landing system evenly distributed. But as the rocket neared the surface, an unexpected gust of wind threw it slightly off course. "Adjust trajectory," one of the engineers called out. Layla's heart sank as she watched the system struggle to compensate. The rocket wavered, its movements erratic as the team scrambled to regain control. "Elon, we're losing stability," someone shouted, panic creeping into their tone. Elon's eyes narrowed, his mind working faster than anyone else's in the room. "Switch to manual override," he ordered. "Now." The room was chaos as the team executed the command. Layla could only watch, her chest tightening as the rocket continued its descent. For a brief moment, it seemed like all hope was lost. And then, as if by a miracle, the adjustments kicked in. The auxiliary systems she had suggested redistributed the load just in time, stabilizing the rocket and allowing it to touch down gently on the landing pad. The room erupted in applause, but Layla barely heard it. Her knees felt weak, and her head spun as the relief washed over her. Elon turned to the team, his face calm but triumphant. "Well done," he said simply, his words carrying a weight that silenced the room. He then walked toward Layla, his gaze steady and unreadable. "You saw the flaw before anyone else," he said. "Without your idea, this might have gone very differently." Layla swallowed hard, the enormity of his words settling over her. "Thank you," she managed, her voice trembling. Elon placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression softening. "This is why you're here, Layla. Don't ever doubt that." As the celebrations continued around her, Layla slipped out of the room to catch her breath. She stood outside under the vast expanse of the night sky, the faint hum of the rocket's engines still audible in the distance. For the first time, she allowed herself to truly feel the weight of everything she had accomplished. From selling candy on the streets to standing here, playing a part in something that would change the world, her journey had been nothing short of extraordinary. And yet, she knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of what she could achieve. As she looked up at the stars, a quiet determination settled within her. She had found her place, and she wasn't going to stop now. The future was hers to build, one step at a time. In the days following the launch, Layla became somewhat of a legend within SpaceX. Engineers who had once barely noticed her now stopped to chat, curious about the intern who had contributed to saving a critical mission. Her desk, once tucked in an unnoticed corner, now carried a quiet sense of respect. Yet, Layla didn't let the attention distract her. She returned to her notebook, her questions, and her relentless pursuit of learning. Elon's words echoed in her mind, "This is why you're here. Don't ever doubt that." But while her confidence had grown, so had her hunger to prove herself further. She knew one success wouldn't define her career. What came next mattered even more. One afternoon, as Layla was reviewing a new set of blueprints, she noticed Tracy approaching with a peculiar expression. "Elon wants to see you in the conference room," she said. Layla's stomach flipped. She nodded, grabbed her notebook, and followed Tracy through the labyrinth of hallways. When she entered the room, she was surprised to see not just Elon but several senior engineers seated around the table. On the screen at the front of the room was a design unlike anything she had seen before. "Layla, have a seat," Elon said, his tone steady but carrying a hint of intrigue. She sat down, clutching her notebook tightly. Elon gestured to the screen. "This is the prototype for a new lunar rover we're developing. It's unlike anything we've built before. Lighter, faster, and designed for extended missions on the moon's surface. But there's a problem with the stabilization system. It's been failing in every simulation." Layla's eyes widened as she studied the design on the screen. The complexity of the system was overwhelming, but she forced herself to focus. "We've spent weeks trying to fix it," one of the engineers added, his tone grim. "Every adjustment we make seems to create another issue." Elon leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "We need fresh eyes on this. Layla, I want you to take a crack at it." Layla blinked, stunned. "Me?" "Yes," Elon said, his voice firm. "You've proven you can think outside the box. That's what we need right now." The room was silent as Layla processed his words. She felt the weight of their expectations pressing down on her, but she also felt a flicker of excitement. This was her chance to prove that she wasn't just lucky, that she truly belonged here. "I'll do my best," she said finally, her voice steady despite the nerves coursing through her. Over the next week, Layla poured herself into the project. She spent hours poring over the design, running her own calculations, and brainstorming ideas late into the night. Her notebook became a chaotic map of her thoughts, filled with sketches, equations, and half-formed theories. At one point, she hit a wall. Every solution she tested seemed to create more problems, and the frustration began to wear on her. Doubts crept in, whispering that maybe she wasn't ready for this. One evening, as she sat alone in the cafeteria staring at her notes, Sam walked in and noticed her slumped shoulders. He grabbed a cup of coffee and sat across from her. "Looks like you're carrying the weight of the world," he said with a grin. Layla sighed. "It feels like it. I can't figure it out, Sam. Every idea I come up with falls apart." Sam leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Let me tell you something," he said. "When I first started here, I felt the same way. Every mistake felt like the end of the world. But you know what I learned? Sometimes the answer isn't about being perfect, it's about persistence. Keep pushing, even when it feels impossible. That's how you break through." Layla nodded slowly, his words sinking in. "Thanks, Sam," she said, a small smile forming on her lips. The next day, Layla approached the problem with fresh determination. She revisited her earlier ideas, looking for patterns she might have missed. Slowly, a new concept began to take shape, one that combined elements of previous designs but approached the stabilization system from an entirely different angle. When she finally presented her proposal to Elon and the team, her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was strong. She explained her idea in detail, walking them through the mechanics and the reasoning behind each adjustment. The room was silent as she finished. Then, one of the senior engineers nodded thoughtfully. "It's unconventional," he said. "But it could work." Elon's eyes narrowed as he studied the design on the screen. "Run the simulation," he said, his tone clipped. The minutes that followed felt like an eternity. Layla watched the screen, her heart pounding as the simulation ran through its paces. When the results finally appeared, a wave of relief swept through the room. Her adjustments had worked. The stabilization system was holding up under stress for the first time. Elon turned to her, a rare smile on his face. "You just saved this project," he said. "Well done." Layla felt a swell of pride, but she also knew this was just another step in a much larger journey. As the team congratulated her, she silently promised herself that she would keep pushing, keep learning, and keep proving that she belonged. Because this wasn't just about rockets or engineering. It was about finding her place in a world that had once seemed out of reach and showing others that they could do the same. Months passed, and Layla's role at SpaceX continued to evolve. What had started as an internship born out of a single-chance encounter was now shaping into something much bigger. Layla wasn't just learning anymore. She was contributing in ways that even seasoned engineers began to notice. She was no longer just the girl with the notebook. One afternoon, as Layla was reviewing test results from the lunar rover project, Elon called her into his office. His demeanor was calm, but his sharp eyes hinted at something important. "Layla, sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. She sat down, her notebook resting on her lap. "Is something wrong?" she asked cautiously. "No," he replied, leaning back slightly. "In fact, it's the opposite. I've been watching you. You've come a long way in a short time." Layla felt her cheeks flush. "Thank you," she said quietly. Elon nodded, his expression thoughtful. "But now, I want to give you a bigger challenge, one that will push you further than anything you've done so far." Layla's pulse quickened. "What kind of challenge?" He tapped a few keys on his tablet, and a schematic appeared on the screen behind him. It was a new design, a prototype for a Mars lander. The room seemed to shrink as Layla took in the complexity of the project. "This," Elon said, turning to look at her, "this is the next step. We're in the early stages, and there are a lot of problems we haven't solved yet. I want you to join the core team working on it." Layla's eyes widened. She had dreamed of contributing to something like this, but now that it was being handed to her, the weight of the opportunity felt immense. I don't know if I'm ready," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. Elon leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "No one ever feels ready," he said. "That's why you start anyway. I'm not asking you to have all the answers. I'm asking you to bring your perspective, your instincts, and your determination. That's why you're here." Layla swallowed hard, her doubts clashing with the spark of excitement igniting inside her. She nodded slowly. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steadier now. "Good," Elon said with a faint smile. "The team meets tomorrow morning. Be ready. The following weeks were some of the most intense of Layla's life. The Mars Lander project was unlike anything she had worked on before. Every detail, every calculation, every piece of the design felt monumental. The team was composed of some of the brightest minds at SpaceX, and while they were welcoming, Layla couldn't help but feel the pressure to prove herself all over again. Her days stretched into nights as she worked tirelessly, often staying long after the rest of the team had gone home. She immersed herself in the technical details, pushing herself to learn faster, think deeper, and contribute in meaningful ways. But as the project progressed, so did the challenges. One evening, the team hit a major roadblock. The propulsion system, critical to the lander's success, wasn't delivering consistent results in simulations. The team spent hours brainstorming solutions, but nothing seemed to work. Layla sat at her workstation, staring at the data. Her mind raced, piecing together fragments of knowledge she had gathered over the months. Slowly, an idea began to form. It was bold, borderline reckless, but it might just work. She hesitated, glancing at the senior engineers huddled around the central screen. Would they even listen to her? She wasn't sure, but she knew she had to try. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through the low murmur of the room. The team turned to her, some with curious expressions, others with mild impatience. "I think I might have a solution," Layla said, stepping closer to the group. She quickly sketched out her idea on the whiteboard, explaining how they could modify the propulsion system to improve its stability. Her explanation was met with silence at first, but then one of the engineers nodded slowly. "It's risky," he said, echoing her own thoughts. "But it's worth testing," another added. Elon, who'd been standing quietly at the back of the room, stepped forward. His gaze moved from the whiteboard to Layla. "Run it," he said simply. The next few hours were a blur of activity as the team implemented Layla's suggestion. She worked alongside them, double-checking calculations and running diagnostics. When the simulation finally completed, the room held its breath. The propulsion system held steady. A wave of relief and excitement swept through the team. Layla let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in hours. "Well done," Elon said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable note of approval. "This was a critical step. You've earned your place here, Layla." She smiled, her heart swelling with pride. But even as the team celebrated, she knew there was still a long way to go. The journey to Mars was far from over, and the challenges ahead would only grow tougher. As she walked out of the building that night, the stars above seemed closer than ever. For the first time, she truly believed that one day she might stand on the red soil of Mars, not as an observer, but as someone who helped make it possible. And in that moment, she knew she wasn't just chasing a dream. She was building one.